I'm Janis.
And I'm Darren.
And this is Event Horizon. So pretty much every time Darren and I meet, we end up circling around the deep sense that there is a deep and long control program playing out in ways that none of us could ever really have imagined, even the most imaginative among us. We also inevitably end up talking, however, about the resistance and the terraforming, the larger scale terraforming we're experiencing. We're aware that these two areas are regular fare on Event Horizon, and in fact, it's one of the reasons we started Event Horizon in the first place. But today we want to dig in a little more directly to this topic by exploring what's happening, how you recognize the various forces at play, and what the endgames may be. Most especially want to talk about what we can and should all be doing in this time. So Darren, this is a topic I know we talk about a lot. In fact, it's the reason we started Event Horizon in the first place, as I just said. So what's been recently emerging that you're paying attention to?
Yeah, this is definitely something we overarchingly reflect on in pretty much all of our conversations because it's impossible not to notice it underway as we speak. I think when I reflect on what's happening, why it's happening, that kind of thing, how we can respond, something that occurs to me is that first and foremost, and this has been emerging more recently, is that we have to be honest and realistic about the challenge we face and the degree of the challenge. We're also going to have to, I think, really rethink how we live our lives, how we do community. In other words, what's required here in order to make this passage successfully, again, referring to Event Horizon there, we will need to be different people living differently. And when you and I have tuned into the fact that this is not an ending, though, this is a transition to something else, even though the transition is going to be pretty bumpy, that means that we also need to prepare ourselves for that new world. And I think that it's going to be significantly different enough that it's going to require different skills, and we should begin to work on those now. That's kind of my sense. And lastly, I just want to say before we kick off here that what's arising in terms of the challenges we're facing, which we'll identify in a minute, that's not just happenstantial. It feels very clear to me, and this relates back to my revelation I had on Christmas Day that I've referred to a few times, that there's definitely a control structure underway. And it's not even just working on the material level. It feels like a metaphysical level kind of control structure. And that shouldn't surprise us, I guess, Janis, in light of the fact that we often talk about the UFO phenomenon, which we know in many ways is a new guise for the same beings we used to call gods with a small g historically. But that's kind of what arises for me in terms of how to kick off this conversation. It's just to frame it, understanding what will be required of us, but also living into the potential there, but also being really honest about the seriousness of the situation we find ourselves in. So when I begin with that, what's your response to all that?
It's interesting because it's pulling up memories of when we first started talking about, well, all this was, just a little over a year ago. We both agreed that we spent many, many hours talking about many, many things. We've covered lots of ground. We ultimately agreed that there was something very concerning happening, that it probably wasn't random. It was by design, that it involved many, many channels, many of which were material, but then there were things that were certainly not material, right on down into the magical. And that we were concerned about how much we wanted to dive into that here. Remember, there was these conversations around, well, we shouldn't go too far down this road because this is pretty sobering stuff and it can feel very overwhelming and it can make people feel hopeless. And we don't want to do that. As our conversation has evolved, and certainly as life on this planet has evolved very, very fast over the past year, it seems, it feels important, and just like you're just saying, it feels like, well, we really do now need to very much be honest about what's going on, the depth and breadth of it, the possibilities for the very nefarious endgames, and the possibilities of what could actually come as a result, the suffering that could come in it. But also, and I think part of this is where we got to this conversation today, it's pretty obvious that it's not the only thing happening. A lot of times when I'm in conversations these days with people around this topic, I feel the need to emphasize it looks bad, and it looks like there are some pretty dark, powerful forces arrayed against everything that supports beauty, life, love, all the things that we want to see happen. But I don't think that's the case. I think they're equally matched. I think that there is as much potency in what we would call the light. I really regret, I don't like the light-dark dichotomies so much, but just to be simple here, that the forces of light, good, those that would support life are as strong and powerful and perhaps not as visible. So one of the things that'd be good to get to today is like, how do you recognize it both in yourself and your networks and in others and around the world? Because it is happening. And I think actually we are part of it. You and I, and then probably everybody listening, we're part of those who are here to support what will likely be the terraforming of life as we know it as a result of both of these forces coming together in opposition, but as well, they're going to create something completely new. So, I mean, I have this, continued sense of both fear that can sometimes border on terror, honestly, but just moments. And also this amazing, like, wow, I get to be here and to watch, at least as long as I'm going to be here, and experience and be and embody this, whatever's coming out alchemically from this experience that we're having of these forces kind of coming together. But I think it's harder right now to feel the strands that are feeding hope. But you should, I think listeners, we should feel that because it is here. There are things we can do to really add to it. And that is part of what I'm hoping we'll really be able to dig into today.
Yeah, well said. And I agree also in the terms of the polarity of light and darkness. I look at it more like stages of awareness rather than this black and white binary kind of option. All right. Yes, we want to both talk about the things that are emerging already on the scene that are daunting, but we also want to talk about the things that are also arising simultaneously. They're very promising in terms of consciousness and awareness. And dovetailing on what you said there, Janis, too, I just want to say that this is something we've touched on a bit before, but sometimes it takes contrast to really behoove kinds of changes in people and awarenesses that really do promise a new future rather than just a tweaked version of reality as it exists now. So what we sense is that what this looks like on the other side of whatever we're about to go through, that we've already begun to go through, will look remarkably different. And I think some of the skills that we're going to talk about and cultivating those will be really important for that. But let's kick off first by discussing some of the nefariousness that's underway. Again, we want to remind people, watch your energy even as you're hearing these things, because learning to work with energy can begin even now as we go through some of the daunting challenges. Stay in this mode of proactivity, stay in this mode of remembering, as we discussed before, that we chose to be here, that this is our time, that we feel like we were up for the challenge when we talk about the oversoul kind of level. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here to begin with. So remembering that context can be really helpful as we move forward here. All right. So the first one of the nefarious and overwhelming global developments is information warfare. So the deliberate confusion through deep fakes via AI, which is ever more on the scene, Janis, propaganda, censorship, and psy-ops. So information warfare is a massive one because you win the war in some ways if you can shape the narrative before it's even begun. And that's what's happening here, that we have not just the traditional kind of psy-ops and information warfare as it used to work in the Cold War, for instance, but now everyone is willingly going online, doom scrolling on their phones, and being fed not just disinformation, but now showing up as really convincing video and images that the human brain cannot distinguish at this point from reality. So when you think about that challenge, Janis, and how it's being used to deceive us and to distort reality, what comes to mind for you?
Oh God, so much. I mean, yeah, we've all been here. We've seen it rising, right? We're all to some degree subject to our own habits of mind and our own habits of activity and use around this stuff. So I know we all know what that's about. And of course, the victors always write the stories. I mean, I've been shocked as I've aged truly to find out that some of the things I learned about history that happened or didn't happen in history were completely wrong because whoever wrote the story was the one who decided I was going to be framed. I mean, there are a lot of sacred texts that have the same issue. So that has always been true. And in this case, because of the rise of technology, it becomes very, very easy. And we all willingly just sort of wake up and tap in. And I think that's the most amazing thing. And yeah, as I said, we've been watching it. I will say, though, we learn. Humans we can learn. We do learn. I'm watching, for example, some of the young people in my children's generation. So these are all Gen Z kids, 27 and younger, who are starting to willingly unplug themselves from things. And if they're not even, at their parents' behest or if their doctor suggested it, it's because they see and feel the effects of it and they're saying no. And I think embedded in that experience is the seed to pretty much everything we're going to say, which is the ability for our own discernment, as well as the ability to execute and to use your own motivation, to discipline, to be very thoughtful about where you deploy attention, because attention really is what's being fought for here, because attention is what creates reality. That's why it's all about attention. So if you can grab your attention and focus it on fear or whatever, then we basically collapse the wave around that thing. It's the way that the creation of reality works. So it says all the deepest teachings we have. So in some ways, it's like really a simple formula and it's extraordinarily effective. And then there's other ways. And I think, well, look, we all still have sovereignty. If you start to understand how you're being hooked, unplug. Nobody's got chains around our feet yet. I mean, we're not there yet. We're not in a physical prison yet, but we can make choices. I know it's difficult. And I think that as a psychologist watching all this happen over the past decade or two, I was like, man, it is so brilliantly playing on human limitation and human vulnerability. But limitation, it doesn't define everything. Limitation just means you have to learn how to get stronger. And that is also then an opportunity. And so that is kind of the way I've been seeing it. But I have to say, I'm a little bit dismayed by how few people really seem to be up for learning to exercise the kind of control and discipline that are going to be necessary to pull the plug on this. I mean, it only works because we willingly engage, as you said earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. When we think to how social media has arisen over the last couple of generations, and we think about, at first everyone was amazed because this is free and we can use it whenever we want. But of course, what we were trading in exchange was our data, information about us, so they can track us, understand us, and feed back to us through social media the very kinds of structures that lock us in a kind of addictive cycle. We've talked before about many of these social media companies know people better than their spouses know those people. Sometimes they know them better in a more predictable way than they themselves know themselves. So this is really why we need to cultivate deep self-awareness. We need to develop community. And I was thinking too about what you said there about how difficult it is to sort of get off that train. This is where community makes a huge difference, that it's not just individual people choosing this, but we need to have communities en masse deciding they're going to do this, they're going to live differently, and not just tweaking, not just say, as we often hear, which in itself is helpful. When people say, I'm going to have a social media fast, I'll see you guys in 2 weeks. That's great. But I think we need to really think through our relationship with this in an ongoing sense. And it might take some pretty revolutionary choices. And that's something I want to introduce to people today, that we be willing to expand the scope of what we might consider in light of what we're up against. But again, leaning on what you just said there, Janis, that we have agency, we have sovereignty, but we must exercise it. We must remember that as well. All right, let me mention a couple of the next ones, and we can both riff on this, just so, again, people are conscious about this. So this is not being said so that we feel like we're all suffering under doom and gloom. We're bringing these to people's awareness and to our awareness so we can be conscious about it and choose proactively, because this is so ubiquitous in our culture now. We often are not conscious of what we're doing because we just think we're going with the flow, and in many ways we are. But what does it look like to turn upstream in the midst of this? Okay, so building off what we just talked about, which involved AI to some degree with the deep fakes and all that, we have AI and surveillance expansion. So increasing automation, biometric tracking, we've touched on that before, predictive algorithms that shape behavior and restrict autonomy. So this speaks to what I was just referring to, how we show them our behavior, we show them our thought patterns and our habitual patterns, and they game those and reflect them back to us in even more addictive ways so that we get locked in. And again, we want to remind people that, yes, while that's partly late stage capitalism and social media companies realizing that if you can enrage people and keep them aroused and enraged, they will stay on the platform longer and make the company more money. But that's just one level. I would, again, want to introduce this notion that at a deeper level, there's a control system going on there that is even tweaking the people who are making those decisions, what seem like practical, quote unquote, economic reasons. So AI and surveillance expansion, Janice, and how we can counteract that. What comes to mind for you?
Well, to some degree, there's going to be a limit to what we can do to counteract because they're so widespread. A lot of it isn't really within our purview. It's not something we can control. For example, pretty much anywhere you are physically in the world right now can be visible to someone who wants to see you, and has the right tools for doing that. For example, just because there's so much video technology all over the place. And then, of course, we will willingly give away a lot of information every day. So to some degree, I feel like there's an element of this that is simply part of the way it's going to play out. Just because it's the landscape we are born into, and that it's one of the biggest sort of weapons of war, if you want to think about it that way, that is out there. On the other hand, again, there's a lot that we can do to limit what we give. We can be mindful about how we use devices. We can be mindful about being in spaces like, I don't know about everybody out there, but I will do everything I can to resist smart anything. Like, I don't want a smart refrigerator. I don't want a smart wall. I just don't, because you're inviting surveillance systems into your house, in my mind. There's things I can do, in other words, to limit some of that. But I do think it is the larger landscape that is playing out, and probably there's some stuff we can't do. And part of the way that we'll be fighting, I really am trying to get away from these battle words, because I don't really perceive this as a battle in the same way. And I think it's important. Part of the reason I don't like to use those words, and I really do need to think about how else to describe it, is because when it is framed as a battle between light and dark, or a battle between anything, we basically reaffirm the same systems we're trying to get away from. When we conceive of it that way, we create it that way. And then we're at war again. And part of the reason, the way this has all worked, is to create wars over and over and over. And I don't want to do another war. I don't see that that's what's happening here. In my mind, this is a moment of transformation and transmutation. And actually, to some degree, what we call the dark nefarious forces are contributing maybe kind of needed energetic DNA in a way to move it all forward. I think it's part of what has to happen in order for evolution to occur. So, like you and I have talked about, I would not want a world in which these forces sort of never showed up, because the status quo wasn't working. The status quo isn't the best humanity can achieve. And it's not good. It hasn't been good for the planet. We need a wholesale revolutionary transformation of everything. And that only can start with us. So in my mind, as you and I have come back to over and over, this is an opportunity for consciousness evolution. So it isn't just a matter of rethinking or reconstructing and, picking better people to be in leadership positions within the same basic structures. We have to become very, very different beings. And because then we create out of that. I think I said this in one of the first event horizons we had. The policy that is made around any policy-making table on the planet comes out of the minds of the people who are sitting at the table. So if you want a deep structural change of the policy, they have to be different. And they have to be different in ways that I think is hard for us to conceive of at the moment, because our minds are not there yet. How do you help a 5-year-old understand what it's going to be like when it's 50? You can't. It's just until it's there. But that's what I'm going for. It's like, all right, how do we expand? That what's really happening here is expansion of consciousness. And what's that? Remembrance, awareness. And that goes into all the more, magical worlds, seemingly magical worlds that we like to talk about, because I think that's where that's really, really happening. But anyway, it's a little bit sort of out of the material question you asked, Darren, but there's an alchemical possibility here that is a result of the dance between what we call dark and light, that I think is the real opportunity. It's not so much, are we going to fight and win over the dark? However, on the material scale, of course, that we need to be able to dismantle things that are fundamentally damaging to life on this planet, human and otherwise. That's not serving anybody.
I completely agree. And I really want to underline that point you made about the warfare analogy, because on the one hand, we want to be very sober about the challenge we face, but recognize that the old way of framing things is part of the problem. And I think about how Einstein says you can never solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. And I was just speaking to someone earlier this morning, kind of synchronistically, about this very thing, because we really need to evolve into being differently. But ironically, it's an evolution that it says much about remembrance and deeper resonance as it is about discovering something new. But for that to happen, we have to clear the slate enough, have enough stillness and silence in our life to allow those more subtle cues to come online and to resensitize ourselves to that subtle gnosis, basically, is what it is. This is something that's been coming through for me really, really strongly. And I've been ever more encouraged to cultivate a life that allows for that to arise. But we absolutely need to realize that, like you say, it's not just about winning according to the rules of the game that exist now. We need to change the game. And that's something that really, I think, is worthy of deep meditation, because it's something that we have to evolve into. It's a transition. It's not something you just flip like a switch. I also want to say really quickly, before I jump into the next one, when you mentioned the thing about smartphones and smart homes and all that, that I literally saw someone last week posting this because it looked kind of funny, but it speaks to exactly what you're saying, because this young girl, I think she was an adolescent, she was complaining her mom had taken away her cell phone. But later on, people saw that she was still posting on social media. And when they looked at the device, it was coming through the LG smart fridge. So literally the smart fridge in their kitchen was being used for her to be able to post online and social media. So this speaks to the problem that right now we talk about putting down our phone, but it's going to be much more than that. It's going to be more than our phones and our laptop. It's going to be the smart glasses people are wearing. It's going to be every single time they walk into a building or step outside and they're under a satellite and can access through even brain chips that people are going to opt for in the future that already are coming online. Again, if we don't ahead of time give real thought to what kind of life we want to cultivate, what kind of world do we want to live in? If we don't give forethought to that, then we will end up being in the world we don't want, and largely because we were sleeping through the process.
Yeah, thank you. That is so important. And what a funny story that this is. Oh gosh, I can only imagine what's coming. And I kind of feel like it's probably, I mean, I don't know how you think about this, and you listeners, I'm not sure how you guys all feel about this, but I kind of assume humanity is a largely technological species. It's going to evolve more technology as it goes. I don't know that, we're not the beings from Avatar, I wish we were in some ways. I would love that. It speaks to my soul. But I do think there are ways in which we can use technology to augment the experience of life, embodied life, both as human and other forms of life on this planet, and to augment and maximize the enjoyment of the beauty of this planet and all that it holds, and not destroy it or ourselves. For example, we can use technology, I imagine, to facilitate cross-species communication. Like, wouldn't it be so cool to be able to talk to a whale or a dolphin or a zebra, or I don't know. I imagine that there are ways, or plant life. It's already kind of happening. I've seen some pretty interesting posts. And of course, we all use, if technology has really enhanced my life in some pretty important ways just by facilitating connections I would never otherwise have had. So how we use technology will be a really, really important question going forward. And I love what you just said about the importance of it, of being really thoughtful. Like, is this technology and is my use of this particular kind of technology, what is it facilitating? Even if we're not using it for our own, nefarious for purposes of our own, but is it facilitating that somehow? And how do we have say in how things are used? I think that those are questions for, as we go down the road. That said, I'm quite sure there are people on this planet who are going to use technology in ways that will make me extraordinarily uncomfortable. I kind of take that as a given, partly because as a developmental psychologist, part of what you spoke to just a minute ago, part of what I'm very keenly aware of is its process of development. We don't just go from child to adult. You go through a lot of different stages, and some of them are very, very uncomfortable, clunky, and highly risky, and sometimes life extinguishing. So I don't know. Humanity has a number of passages to go through before we end up anywhere close to wise when it comes to technology use. And hopefully we'll destroy ourselves and other things that are important in the meantime. But this is where that starts. It's right here, right now, in these conversations, in our own minds. And, I would say, please let us be thoughtful, compassionate, empathetic, aware, and willing to do the work every day of, whatever that means for each of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And towards the end, we'll get into what doing the work looks like in some practical ways. But I think we're both underlining this really key aspect, which is we need to now, while we have the capability to not be completely overwhelmed by the technology that is winding its way into our lives, we want to now choose proactively how we're going to use that technology, not wait until it's completely infiltrated every aspect of our lives, even potentially our biology, before we ask the question, is this a good idea? All right, let me mention a few more that are the daunting challenges we face. And the first one speaks to what you referred to earlier in terms of the way we frame this, that in addition to framing things in terms of war and warfare, we literally are facing pretty intense geopolitical conflict and polarization as well. So escalating wars around the world, we think about what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Europe. We think about the civil unrest and the cultural fracturing in our country, in America. We think about weaponized ideologies, and again, using those tools of AI and deepfakes and propaganda to service those ideologies too. And so many people are not even getting to the point where they're able to evaluate equally the different options on the table because they're being so swamped with propaganda and weaponized ideologies. So that's a lot. We've also got a big one, Janis. I think, again, when we think about the sobering challenge we face, a lot of it comes down to the day-to-day welfare of people, which comes down to people's economic realities. And we know that there's economic manipulation that keeps people just above the board, just enough to keep going and not cause mass revolt, but at the same time, slowly but surely disable them, disempower them because they're slaves to a system. So we've got debt traps, inflation, wealth centralization, and control through scarcity and fear of collapse. So speaking of framing, one of the things that I think about in terms of framing is that we need to move beyond the illusion of separation and a subset of that, which is the illusion of scarcity. But the control structures try to make you continue to think that way by always keeping you right along that line of almost being in a great degree of scarcity, right? That poverty line that people kind of scrape along in. And this is not just an economic matter, right? This is a matter of the way that energy is wielded and this deep understanding of human psychology is wielded so as to control people. And again, we're back at this notion that we need to be aware of the tools being brought to bear, but also be cognizant of the structures behind that that are using that in a very strategic manner.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that because that is such a huge one, right? And it has been one of the ways that we've been controlled and controllable for a long, long time. And it's a tricky one because it's real. It's materially real. I know multiple people who are really struggling. And in a couple cases may or have been on the street or may very well end up there again. It's heartbreaking, right? So at the material level, part of what I feel like I talk to a lot of people about, including people in my world and myself, is like generosity and compassion and how can I help? I think there may come a time in which we will all be asked to do things we may not have ever considered. Like, you're ready to take somebody into your home if they're homeless. And it will happen. That will happen to some degree. There are going to be people who suffer. So how much are we as individuals willing, able, prepared to assist? If you have land, would you be willing to put on some tiny houses or invite people to put some tiny houses or yurts or things that we don't need a lot? I mean, that's another lesson here is stuff. Oh my God, just we don't need nearly as much stuff as we have. So how can we downsize, give away, create small spaces where people can have dignity? Because here's the thing, when people can't live with dignity, they get violent and crime goes up because every human is going to want to try to survive. And if they have a family, they're going to want to try to have their kids survive. So we think that creating some sort of border is going to keep people from coming north when there's no water or when their societies are collapsing. Think again, that's not going to happen. And we should, anybody who's capable of it, and I know a lot of people are not, so I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to do this, but anybody who's capable of starting to think about realistically, what it might look like when our friends, neighbors, families, or even people we don't know start needing to preserve their dignity and their life. What are we willing and able to do? I think it's a really good idea. That's the material thing. The spiritual thing, and gets very interesting, right? Because as we've talked about a lot, this is all consciousness and it's all energy. And where we direct our attention is what gets created. And the creation here is a co-created reality. So how can we, at the same time that we're being material realists and preparing and all that stuff, be also doing the practices that are very helpful in visioning another world, the world that we want to live in which all life has the capacity for dignity? Because that's the quantum. That's working in the quantum realm. And I think that's one of the most exciting possibilities for humanity right now, is to really learn and to remember that this isn't real in the way that it seems. And non-duality is both and. Non-duality isn't think outside another box, like skip the two dualities and find something else. It's like, can you conceive that they're both true at the same time? So the material truth reality is true. The scarcity stuff is true. And yet it's not, because it's something we're dynamically creating. And how do we work at that space? Can we hold both? Can we address both? That is a really big challenge, but I think it's possible. And if we can do that, if enough of us can do that, then we will see changes, and it can happen in unique and fascinating and wild and cool ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think here of something I often say in my classes and whatnot, which is that every event, every circumstance, every person we meet is actually an energetic configuration that we're being given the opportunity to work with and wield energy and to transmute energy. And so on the one hand, like you say, it's having this perspective that resources are real. When resources seem scarce, that's a real issue people face. But underlyingly, it's an energetic concern in terms of not just energy in the traditional understanding, but working with the energy in ourselves so as to create a different relationship with each other, with the planet, with reality in general. I also want to touch on, before we move to the really positive things that are also arising simultaneously, something that you kind of hinted at there when you talked about various collapse that makes people run the borders and things. And that is that, of course, we're facing ecological collapse in various ways. And people continue to debate about what's causing that. But regardless of that, we still have to face the fact that it is happening, and we need to prepare for that. And burying our heads in the sand is not going to help with that. And lastly, I want to say before I move on to the positive ones, all of these together create what's called crisis fatigue, where the human psychology can only handle so much before it's just overwhelmed and kind of shuts down. So this is partly, again, why we need to develop these deep practices, a meditative practice, a grounding practice, join in community with people who are supporting each other in that, because there is a lot of overwhelm, and the overwhelm in itself can be the problem when people give up or surrender in the face of that. So again, the opportunity, and I think the necessity, is for us to develop those practices now, those skills now, so that we can handle what's coming, because the wave is still growing in intensity at this point. We want to get to the transition on the other side of the wave, but to do that, we need to prepare ourselves. And that's something I think we're both underlining as a sobering sense right now. All right. Let's move on to the positive things, though, Janis, that are also arising. And you and I have talked about this many times in our conversations, that I know you left the life you used to have because you had this sense that people were going to begin to wake up and join together and respond to this moment in really positive ways. I have a similar sense, and both of us over the last few years have had our lives practically massively change in terms of where we live and who we're interacting with and what we're doing. And that also means saying no and goodbye to some circles because it doesn't serve who we are feeling called to evolve into. So again, we're encouraging people today to really have a sobering look at your life, but also, as much as you're paying attention to the real challenges, this rising tide of challenges, be also aware of just the degree of transformation that's available on the other side of that. And to some degree, energetically, those two things are connected. So sometimes contrast is what allows us to make this transition, to meet the moment with enough intensity that we actually create a new world, not just a world that's tweaked from the existing status. All right. So first one, Janice, in terms of what's emerging that's really positive, and of course, it's exactly what's needed, and I don't think that's a coincidence, is increased interest in inner work. So we're seeing a surge in meditation interest in our society. We're seeing a surge of interest in psychedelics and the different realms and states of being that open up with that. We're seeing interest in breath work. Trauma healing people are taking seriously, recognizing how disabling trauma is and taking seriously working through that. And alongside that is shadow integration and the cultivation of spiritual practices. So reflect for a moment for me what you've noticed there in the people around you, even people entering into some of these notions for the first time.
Yeah, a lot. Actually, it feels like I mean, my dominant sense has always been that everybody who incarnated right now, everybody in a body knew exactly what they were coming into. That this moment of evolution is marked by both what we call negative and positive forces. That it's necessary, as I just said, that that's the engine that drives evolution. So, in a way, there's nothing wrong if you want to evolve. But in terms of us, being the part of this whole experience that is bringing in the broadened awareness, those of us who are really kind of, that's our job. That's part of what we signed up for. There, I see nothing. I see so much. I've seen it across the arc of my life. It's amazing. I mean, I think we've talked about this another times. Just if I think about the number of books, for example, in the 1970s that were available related to spirituality in the way that we think about it today, the more Eastern flavored or mystical flavored or indigenous flavored versions, it's not, it was a finite set I know there are many more titles than I was aware of, but there was a fairly finite set. You could have almost all of them on your bookshelf. Holy cow, not anymore. I mean, you need to have huge reading rooms to have all the wisdom and the wisdom holders that are here. And there's people I know you and I talk about this a lot, and I'm sure everybody listening has had this experience. Like people just seem to be quote unquote waking up every day. What do I mean by that? They're developing interests, as you said, in what we used to be called or thought of as sort of esoteric relaxation techniques, but that are not. They're starting to have dreams and knowings, just knowings that don't leave, that transform their life. It doesn't leave after they've had it. It seems to work on them, wheedles their way in. Synchronicities up the wazoo. Raise your hand, everybody, if you had synchronicities in the last 24 hours, whether it's repeating numbers or just, I don't know, we all know the crazy little things and big things that are just so common now that I think a lot of us I hardly even mention them anymore to people. But I just go, oh, God, here's another one. It's like the world is becoming increasingly magical in every way. And the veil is thinner and thinner. And the veil between sort of what we think of as the formless and the form, as well as the veil of our own ignorance, it's just thinner. People are starting to see the sort of the shadows behind and get curious about them and start to want to focus on them. I know tons of people, like we've talked about before in this program, I've lots of people who just can't focus in the way they used to focus on the same stuff. They don't want the same stuff. The idea of working X many more years so they can have their retirement and get their RV so that they can go, go on the road. A lot of that is just fading away. The desire for it is fading away. I've seen that in a lot of people, especially people who they don't really know why. I'll listen to them talk about it and they don't talk about it in spiritual terms and they're not really connected that way, but they're definitely feeling just deep decrease in the desire for the standard material stuff and more desire to kind of just sit and be in nature and things like that. I look at all that. I'm like, yep, that's exactly what you would expect to see. It made me think of the other day I was thinking about, how we spiral over different times. So there's resonances, there's vibrational resonance between two moments in time. And you can see, for example, in astrology. So you can say we have a constellational alignment that, you last saw during the French Revolution or something like that, which is actually true right now. But it's different. We have a constellation lineup, not a constellation lineup, but we have sort of things going on astrologically that are really, really unique. And I was thinking the other day, I feel very much like we're spiraling over the Dark Ages, medieval times. Because it's man, you look around, you're all the henchmen are here, all the cruelest, coldest, darkest, most conniving, awful people. Sociopaths are all seem to be in body at the same time and in positions of power. Whoa. But, and I it's scary. I can feel it in me because I'm ooh, this is, I think I died these people multiple times. I really don't want to run into them again. But At the same time, it feels like all that magic is here too. Because remember, that time was really marked by magic. And there was much less of a veil between the formless and the form, and there was much more remembrance about how to use it. I think all that's here too. So it does feel like the flavor of this time is kind of unique in the degree to the degree to which we can access what would have been considered magical and mystical kinds of knowings to leverage and expect that there's going to be some pretty interesting outcomes as a result of that.
Yeah, that completely tracks and comports with what I'm noticing too. The synchronicities absolutely are out the wazoo. And it gets to the point, and I've talked about this recently, where you start recognizing once your relationship with reality changes and evolves, you start recognizing that the whole thing is synchronicity, actually. And that what we before used to call synchronicity was just it reaching a certain threshold of our awareness of it. But once you tune in and turn your attention in that direction, you start recognizing that you have a relational situation with reality itself. And on that note, too, when you spoke about the veil thinning, that's absolutely something I've been tracking for quite a while now. And I think it's a really good way of describing what's going on. And I also want to point out that we often sometimes, to make the point of this dance between the form and the formless, we'll talk about those two possibilities. But I also think about it as myriad numbers of in-between realms that are between the form and the formless, and realms that are more subtle than this one, but still have some substance to them. And what seems to be happening is other realms, other kinds of beings, other realities are merging with ours in many ways. And when you think about the UFO phenomenon and how often the beings spoke about doing preparatory work and helping evolve the consciousness of humankind so we will be prepared to allow for that kind of new alignment, that new reality to be forged from two joining together, that also seems to be in play here. And I also think about absolutely what you described there, where it's like everything's on the scene. The most nefarious actors, as well as the most overarchingly positive and benevolent and ascendant beings, are also on the scene. And the contrast is being demonstrated in our midst so that we will make these really consequential choices. I also want to say that, like you said, dreams is another way that this shows up for people. Inner guidance, intuition, right? We have even people like Gary Nolan now talking about the caudate putamen, these different structures of the brain that seem to speak to how intuition is kind of working physiologically. You and I have talked recently about you can now order these machines that change the electrical activity in the frontal lobes so that your psi capacities go up, which is fascinating. So in the midst of, again, to your point you made earlier, we have technology that definitely in some ways can be used to disempower us. There will also be technologies coming online, in addition to things like psychedelics and meditative states, but also ways we were able to create different biochemical states through the use of these kinds of frequency transmitters, basically. We will be able to recognize that reality is much more multifaceted than we've been told. And that itself will, I think, begin to change and further increase what you're already noticing in people deciding that getting their retirement and buying an RV and going to Florida is not what they want to do anymore. When suddenly you can explore these other realms. And as you do that, recognize that you're much more than the physical body, then what people choose really opens up and becomes very, very interesting. Okay, so those are some of the inner things that are happening, the ways that new competencies are coming online, new capacities are coming online, ways that even technology is coming online to help support that. Let's also think about some of the ways people are greeting the economic challenges we spoke to. So here I'm thinking of a meta-category of decentralization movements. So a rise in self-sovereignty, crypto, homesteading, alternative education, and citizen journalism. So as some of these traditional services break down, like for instance, journalism, we're seeing people step into the gap. And we're seeing some people say, okay, this system does not support the sovereignty and the dignity of human beings, therefore we're going to do it differently. So once again, we've got the contrast being severe enough that people are saying, if the system will not support us, let's create new systems. What do you think about when you notice that happening in our midst as well?
Oh, I think it's wonderful, and it's exactly what needs to happen. Like, I don't know if this is a thing, but it really keeps coming into my mind. I learned recently about the Catars Thanks to Matthew. Thank you, Matthew. And some other people I was in a conversation with around that. And I did not know the really dark history. I mean, these people were brutally wiped out for basically a lot of the non-dual tenets that we talk about a lot. They were 0.26% of the global population, eradicated over 100 years and 19 popes. There's like a paragraph about them in most of the religious textbooks, and they were regarded as heretical. Okay, so I'm like, okay, but that was a group of people who were a little bit like the Essene, as far as I can tell. They were just good, simple, embodied people, and they were eradicated because they didn't fit the program here. Well, I wondered. I was like, well, it seems like the smart thing to do if you were going to be a counterbalance to the darkness at this time would be to incarnate in a decentralized way. Don't incarnate as a group where you can get easily wiped out in one go. You incarnate individually. And it does feel like, people that just sort of the wisdom holders, people who are just organically getting turned on, or who just came in that way, are popping up everywhere, and they're all over the place in all these different families, and all these different communities, and all these different professions. And that feels, so it feels in some ways like the very nature of again, I'm going to go back to this term light. I don't love it, but the sort of positive polarity side of this big equation is in a decentralized way. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that everything that we do in order to create a really alternative way of living would also reflect that. And it makes more sense. I mean, we know there's tons of research that it shows over and over. Humans function best in small groups, that are not so anonymous. As soon as you get us in really large groups and anonymity, then crime, violence, lots of stuff that is antisocial goes up. It's helpful if we're in small groups and we know each other. I mean, it goes back to one of the things I was thinking when you were talking about the technologies that are going to be used to enhance psy-ability, for example. That's all really good, but it's really going to be very, very bad if it's not accompanied by expansion in empathy, compassion, and desire for, supporting life. I mean, that's how you get dark wizardry. Like, it's probably one of the reasons that wizardry is, I don't know, the veil between the wizard and the muggle was pretty thick for a while, and that probably wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because all that magic can be used for very dark purposes. In fact, I think it is being used for very dark purposes by some. So we don't want to evolve and expand and grow without growing all parts of us. Don't just grow your psi ability without also growing the desire for connection, the understanding of the reverence. What's precious here is life, not stuff. That's what makes incarnation precious, things like that. I don't know how we do that, but I do think it happens in sort of ways that you were talking about, just in smaller groups where it's shared endeavors, like creating community, where we're doing basic things. Let's not spend all day on a device. Let's interact with the earth again. And not because we have to survive, exactly, because it's living and sentient, and we can learn an expanded awareness to have really satisfying relationships with all kinds of life in every way. That's the reason, right? And that's what it afford us. So I think it's it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to go for. I think it is what's happening. People are starting. I'm really excited to see where it goes. And I'm especially excited to see that young ones, I think our children age group, the Gen Z groups and younger, also have knowledge. They just came in with knowledge that's going to be really, really helpful for creating new kinds of communities and stuff. But it's just, it's just not quite time yet. But I'm really, really, I watch them very closely. Like, what are they going to start creating when it's time, and how will we all know it's time? I think we're getting closer, obviously, but I don't think we're quite there.
Let's touch on a couple other elements of the positive movements that are happening, and then we'll dive into the last part of our podcast here, where we talk about some of the things we can do in terms of practices and whatnot. So one thing that's happening in the midst of all that propaganda and the use of AI to control and psy-ops and all that is that there is a growing number of people that are waking up to manipulation in media. They are waking up to the way that the pharmaceutical industry is gamed to take advantage of people, and how its unhealthy and kind of dark relationship with capitalism plays out in terms of, again, the lack of dignity when it comes to treating human beings. We think about people are looking into how finance works and how the game is rigged again to support the people who are already the elite. So this is all generating deeper inquiry and opening up new possibilities. So even as the game is being upped in a way that the techniques being used are more sophisticated and subtle, there also is more subtle awareness in people. And as we spread the word, and that's one thing we need to do, people, is spread the word, that is growing as well. I also want to say, too, this is something you and I have touched on, that the UFO discussion comes in here because there's this growing mainstream acknowledgement of non-human intelligences in our midst. Again, the beings we might have called small g gods in the past. And that itself, and the way that it shows up with high strangeness and synchronicity and all that, is challenging rigid materialist paradigms. That's really, really helpful. We need to get past that in order to make this transition. And I also want to just, again, highlight what you said earlier in terms of we have to identify how each of these problems share in common this illusion of separation and the illusion of scarcity. We have to rethink how things got this way to begin with to really dream into being possibilities that will be fundamentally different. All right. So all that said, now let's talk about some strategies in the last few minutes here that we can employ to deal with the times that we're in. And we say this not just in the terms of this is something you might want to try. Like, we're really encouraging people, let's step up our game together so that we can meet this moment. So one key aspect that I would want to bring in, Janis, is discernment practice. I want to underline there practice, because people might say, well, you either are discerning or you're not. But as you and I have talked about, you have to work through this process of identifying distortion in yourself, work through those things. You go to a deeper level, you find more distortion, you work through that. And as this happens and you cultivate greater self-awareness, then your discernment grows. And in order to do this, you need to cultivate stillness. You need to start allowing for enough silence that your intuition can speak to you. And you need to use critical thinking also, is something that you and I have stressed. We don't want to just go into the woo and not recognize that we have these rational, critical thinking brains that can help us parse signal from noise. So we've talked about using both those capacities, the kind of subtle, magical, enchanting capacities that are tapped into the field itself, as well as the parts of us that can look at data and say, is this well supported or not? And in an era of psy-ops, both of those approaches are going to be important.
Thanks. I think that is absolutely true. And I'm super excited actually to be able to, I mean, one of the courses I'm going to be teaching in the fall is about subtle sensing and getting through these layers so that you can recognize your own distortion, as well as how to continually refine your subtle senses so that you're getting data. And there are ways to make it faster so you can recognize them quicker. So anyway, I'm excited about that, everybody. Also, I think part of what we need to do also is it's not that hard to identify the force agenda, but if you can trace down the line of like whatever it is you're interacting with, what is its end goal? Does it want to centralize? Does it want to control? Does it want to pull you outside of your own knowing? Does it want to posture as the authority? Does it want to obscure truth but demand that you believe it? Ask questions. I mean, curiosity, I think, is one of the absolute most important tools that we have to navigate this time. Get curious. It's kind of shocking to me how not curious people are. They tend to just they just want to get to the knowing, and then they want to stand in the knowing. Stop. Don't do that. Stay open and keep going. Why? What? How? Just keep asking. And because in some ways, at least the way I understand the experience of embodiment, is you are the answer to the question, but you don't get it if you don't ask it. So asking questions is absolutely the most central thing. I mean, when I'm in conversation with my guides, or however you want to describe it, my beings, it's really funny. I will get a nothing. I'll get no answer to some question I ask if I ask the wrong question. I feel like I'm consistently getting told, ask the right question. So stay curious, start asking questions, ask yourself, what kinds of answers is this question going to get me? So, and is it the right question? Maybe I'm asking a question that is fundamentally going to lead to a dead end in some way. So anyway, there's that. Just get curious. Courage, I think, is really, really huge. A lot of us are being primed to stay really small in a lot of ways. We talked about that earlier, just like how that all happens. So I think we're all being asked to stand in our courage and flex in ways we never really flexed before. So that's important. And then recognize, as I said earlier, like if you're engaging with someone, a system, an idea, ask yourself what it tends to lead to, because the movements we want are the ones that lead to inner authority. Like, it's one of the reasons I love the Eastern cosmologies, because they're always directing you in. It's there's a lot of guidance around how to get in the meditation, yogic practices, whatever, being in nature. But you need to go in and do what you just said, like learn how to discern using your own equipment. Because something really serious goes down physically, for example, let's say craft appear all over the sky or whatever, something happens, or the grid completely goes down. There's going to be cases in which your neighbors, or the people around you, don't have a single clue. You're going to have to be able to go in and ask yourself and get the best guidance you can, and you're going to have to do the best you can with it. So there's some degree that's the courage. Positive systems decentralize, they distribute tools, they honor complexity. They acknowledge the gray. They invite co-creation. They're not coercive. And mostly they're life affirming. They protect the sacred. They don't want to exploit the sacred. It's not about laying claim to pieces of land that we're now going to extract materials from in ways that are not honorable and honest. So some of it is just recognizing sort of the company you keep, whether it's an idea or people or institutions, and then using curiosity, courage, discernment, tools. Don't be lazy. It's kind of a daily thing that you got to do, but it doesn't have to, it's fun. I mean, I loved it. I don't know about you, but now the time I get inside of myself or out in nature or just sitting with people who bring peace to my soul for a little bit, something I need every day, and I look forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And I'm looking forward to heading to California in a few days for a retreat I'm hosting at Mount Shasta next week, where we won't use technology. We'll just be in person together and exploring the field and our connection to it. It's those kind of things we need more of. I'm just going to identify a couple more in closing here. Obviously, emotional regulation of our nervous system through practices like breath work and somatic therapy. We've also talked about the dream work that's coming online, people's awareness around synchronicities, exploring subconscious material for guidance and integration. We need to develop those skills. And finally, I'll say, in light of what we've said before about compassion and what's going to arise where people will need help, service to others is actually a spiritual practice. So we want to anchor ourselves in compassion-based action to avoid nihilism or detachment, because what we don't want to do is become disassociated in the midst of the overwhelm. We want to meet it, and that actually means feeling more and learning to not be overwhelmed by that process. So these are all some, I think, really helpful ways that we can bring tools to bear to meet this moment. We need to step into these, but I agree with your last point there, that for me, it's incredibly exciting, and this is what I live for now, and it's pretty much my holistic life is around this transition we're making and who I'm becoming in the process. So we're going to close it there. There's always more to explore in this particular event horizon that we're crossing as we speak, but we hope you'll join us again on another edition of Event Horizon.